As a family history researcher, how often have you wished you could ring up a dead person and just ask them, point blank, the genealogical questions that have been bugging you? The truth is, you might not even need to go that far, because the answers might lie with relatives who are still alive right now. Using genealogical methods to find living relatives is a task often relegated to heir searchers, who are hired by a court to find rightful inheritors of a deceased person's estate. But finding living relatives can help any genealogist. You just have to know how and where to look. I'm Josiah Schmidt. It's November 17th, 2014, and you're listening to the German American Genealogist podcast. There are a lot of good reasons for using your genealogical prowess to hunt down living relatives. You may be searching for heirs to an estate, or you may want to find other people who have photographs or tidbits of information on your great-great-grandparents. You might also be interested in putting together a descendancy chart or book that traces all the descendants of a given ancestor. Perhaps you're putting together a family reunion and don't want to leave anyone out. Whatever your reasons, the best place to start is always with the currently living relatives that you already know about. That might mean paying a visit to your great-aunt Edna, who never lets anyone leave her house hungry.
Here, Sonny, have a piece of rhubarb pie. I just made it myself.
Oh, thanks, Aunt Edna. Now, do you ever remember anyone mentioning where in Germany your grandpa emigrated from?
Why aren't you eating? Don't you like the pie?
Oh, sorry, Aunt Edna. So, about your grandpa.
Come on now, have a second piece of pie. You're gonna hurt my feelings.
Oh, Aunt Edna, I really...
Eat it!
Not only might your known living relatives have valuable information on your ancestry that might not be available in any documents anywhere, they will be able to help you find other living relatives that you don't know about yet. You may have a heck of a time on Ancestry.com finding out who your great-grandma's sister married and who her children were, but Great-Aunt Edna might already have the answer for you. Another way that we family history researchers can piggyback off of the knowledge of others is to perform a simple Google search. Oftentimes, genealogists are so focused on searching the designated genealogical databases and repositories that we forget we have a whole World Wide Web at our disposal. Many times, someone else out there has already done the research you're trying to do. A Google search could reveal everything you've been trying to find out, and could put you in touch with a distant cousin who has already spent years compiling sources and documentation. It's easy, when you're trying to find the parent or child of a person on your family tree, to get so focused on making that little connection that you lose sight of the big picture. Many of our genealogical brick walls are a result of us not thinking broadly enough. When reconstructing your family tree, you might just need to go out on a limb, no pun intended, and start researching someone who you haven't connected to your family yet. Look in the geographic area where your ancestor lived and research people with the same surname. By tracing this individual's ancestry back upward, you may find that it connects with yours. This is often a one-way street, so to speak, meaning that you were only able to make this connection by tracing a seemingly unrelated individual's lineage back up to yours. But the availability of documentation would have never allowed you to trace your family down to that person. If the surname you're researching is rare enough, you might even be able to investigate all of the people with that surname in the entire country, or in the entire world. Some of the best sources to look into when hunting for living relatives that you can connect with include obituaries and newspapers. Most obituaries include not just vital dates related to the deceased individual, but also the names of siblings, children, grandchildren, in-laws, and sometimes even nieces, nephews, aunts, and uncles. Older rural newspapers sometimes even provided a list of all the individuals who attended the funeral from out of town. In this case, it usually won't explicitly tell you what the connection was between the deceased person and all of these out-of-towners, but by doing a little research into each of these names, you may find the connection yourself. Besides obituaries, newspapers in general are a great resource for finding living relatives. Many newspapers have been digitized today and are available on websites like newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com, and genealogybank.com, among many others. Newspaper articles can mention family relationships in passing, or they might mention family relationships explicitly, like in birth announcements, wedding announcements, or in a report on a local family reunion that took place. Vital records, such as birth, marriage, and death certificates, can also be a great way to find living relatives. Ancestry.com, for instance, has indexed birth and marriage records in some states all the way up through the 21st century. For states like Minnesota, Ancestry.com shows you the birth date, birthplace, and parents' names for people born as recently as 2002. Even on older vital records, there are often clues to look for on the vital records that deceased people have left behind. Clues we might overlook. Don't just look at the main, juicy information you're initially drawn to, like birth date, death place, and so on. Look in the corner of the records at the boring stuff. Who are the witnesses or informants for the record? A child of the deceased might be the informant for a death certificate. A sibling of the bride or groom might be the witness for a marriage. An uncle or aunt might be the sponsor for a baptism. Probate records are another great way to find living relatives. A last will and testament might name the children of a deceased person. But again, don't just look at the juicy parts, look at the dry and boring parts too. Investigate administration and tax documents in the probate records. Who was named as the executor or administrator of the deceased person's estate? That might be a child or grandchild. Who paid the taxes or filing fees listed in the deceased person's probate records? That could be a younger relative. You would be surprised how much information is out there on living individuals. The plain old phone book might give you clues if you find a person with a particular surname living in a particular geographic area. Whitepages.com combines the phone and address records from across the country into one website. Ancestry.com doesn't just have old documents relating to dead people, they also have a wealth of public records on living people. Check their telephone records and address book records. These often tell you the exact street addresses and exact birthdays of people who were born as recently as the 1980s. There are other websites like Spokio.com and Veromi.com that can help you track down living relatives. On Veromi.com, which is free, you can search for certain names in certain areas, and the website will not only give you the name and age of an individual, it will also show you a list of other names that are associated with that individual. Names of people who have lived at the same address as that person, or who have been listed together on any public records. These other names are almost always close relatives of that person. Sometimes when you're looking for living relatives, you have to do a little fishing rather than hunting. Instead of going out hunting down and bagging yourself a third cousin, you might just need to put a little bait out, sit back, and wait for them to come to you.
Woo! I hooked me a big one.
What have you got, Ted?
Looks like a yellow speckled large-mouthed fourth cousin, Jim.
The best way to do this is by starting a blog where you publish everything you know about your ancestors and document your research process. Inevitably, there is another family history researcher somewhere out there who has the same ancestor as you, and in the course of their research, they will eventually find your blog and get in touch with you, allowing the two of you to pool your knowledge and share your discoveries. The last and perhaps most foolproof of ways to find living relatives that I'm going to talk to you about today is through a method that hasn't even been possible until this past decade. I am, of course, talking about DNA research. If you haven't tried it yet, you're missing out. There are a few different forms of DNA research that you can do, and I recommend trying all three if you can afford it. The first is an autosomal DNA test, which you can get very inexpensively from websites like Ancestry.com or 23andMe. This analyzes a wide breadth of your genetic identity and can estimate how closely you are related to another test subject, no matter which ancestor you both descend from. A Y-DNA test will allow you to drill into your strict paternal line, your father's 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 father, and so on, and can match you up with others whose paternal lineage connects with your paternal lineage. A mitochondrial DNA test, or mDNA test, will do the same thing, but for your maternal line. You can find out where your mother's 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 mother came from and be matched up with other people whose mother's 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 lineage eventually connects with your lineage. After the break, we're going to be joined by a very special guest whom you may have heard of if you're listening to this podcast. Her name is Lisa Louise Cooke, and she's the host of the world-renowned genealogy podcast entitled Genealogy Gems. Lisa has some incredible tricks on how to find and connect with your living relatives, and she's agreed to share a few of them with us. This week in German history. On November 16th in the year 13 AD, 2001 years ago, the general and soon-to-be Emperor Tiberius led a triumphant procession through Rome to celebrate his siege of Germany. His celebration would prove to be premature, as Rome's quest to conquer Germany would prove to be an impossible one that would ultimately help lead to the downfall of the empire. On November 17th in the year 1790, 224 years ago, the German mathematician August Ferdinand Möbius was born. Möbius, who was a descendant of Martin Luther, was also one of the most important mathematicians in history. Several theoretical breakthroughs are named after him, such as the geometric shape known as the Möbius strip, and mathematical concepts like the Möbius transformations, the Möbius transform of number theory, the Möbius function, and the Möbius inversion formula. On November 17th in the year 1929, the German-American inventor Hermann Hollerith died in Washington, D.C. Hollerith was the inventor of the punch card and is credited with being the father of the modern data processing machine, aka the computer. Hollerith founded a company called the Tabulating Machine Company, which would later become known as IBM. On November 22nd in the year 2005, 9 years ago, Angela Merkel became the first female chancellor of Germany, winning over 35% of the vote in a 5-way race. This has been This Week in German History. Your loved ones aren't going to be around forever. Have you ever wanted to sit down and ask your dad about his experience in the war, or interview your grandma to get her life story, but haven't been sure how to conduct the interview and how to ask the right questions? That's why I wrote my new book, 2,000 Questions for Grandparents, Unlocking Your Family's Hidden History. 2,000 Questions for Grandparents contains a manual on how to conduct family history interviews, as well as 2,000 questions on such topics as childhood life, memories of previous generations, world events, outlook on life, marriage and family, career and hobbies, spirituality and politics, likes and dislikes, travels and migrations, military service, and more. Purchase 2,000 questions for grandparents today at a special early bird discount on lulu.com. You can find a link to the book in the publications section at my website www.schmidtgen.com. Today we're conversing with Lisa Louise Cooke, who is the owner of a family history multimedia company called Genealogy Gems, and she is the host of the very popular and very insightful Genealogy Gems podcast, which is listened to in 75 countries around the world and has been downloaded over 1.5 million times. Lisa has also authored 4 books: Turn Your iPad into a Genealogy Powerhouse, How to Find Your Family History in Newspapers, The Genealogist's Google Toolbox, and Genealogy Gems, Ultimate Research Strategies. Lisa, it's an honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Josiah, and congratulations on your new podcast.
Thank you so much. Now, Lisa, how did you catch the genealogy bug in the first place?
Oh, gosh. I was quite young, actually, probably about 8 years old, and I was at my grandmother's house. I was there for a couple of weeks visit and, hanging out, and I was sitting on the floor in the back room, in her family room. And at that level, I could only see the bottom shelf of this big, tall bookcase. Of course, I wasn't all that tall. So I'm sitting there, and I'm looking through them, and there's these, over in the corner, these black, dusty scrapbooks. And as I'm pulling them out, I'm like, well, wait a second, these aren't in color. So what's up with that? That seemed very odd to me. And I also didn't recognize the faces. And so I went into the kitchen and said, Grandma, who are these people? Why are they in your books? And she tossed her towel over her shoulder and said, well, come on, let's sit down, let's talk about it. And I still have the little note paper where she scribbled out the phonetic pronunciations of her mother's maiden name and her father's last name, which had been changed. So her maiden name had been changed from Sporowski to Sporin, and whatever little details she could think of. And I have dabbled off and on, from carrying around kind of a small shoebox full of information to a big cardboard box to now an entire, office full of stuff. But I really got seriously back into it as my kids started getting older. And around 2000, that all kind of lined up with Ancestry coming on board, and then it just became a full-time obsession.
What led you to start podcasting about genealogy, and how did Genealogy Gems in particular come about?
Well, it's interesting because it hasn't been around that long. Podcasting hasn't been. It was invented around 2005. And right around that time, I knew I wanted to do something more with genealogy, and I had gone to my local family history center, and I had brought in something I had gotten from the immigration service at the federal level on my great-grandparents. And I was all excited, and I said, gosh, look what they will send you. And I've got these pictures I've never seen before, and it's really great. And she said, oh, my gosh, can we take a copy of that and put it up on the bulletin board? Because this would be terrific for our patrons. I said, sure, go ahead. So she photocopied the letter that I'd gotten from the government about their immigration file. And as she was pinning it up there on the bulletin board, she said, oh, that's such a genealogy gem. And I thought, I had been keeping my eyes and ears and mind open to how could I reach more people and help them, because I was discovering some kind of new innovative ways to try to make things happen in terms of my research. And as I was looking at that, I thought, that's great, but maybe a dozen people will see this. It's really a shame, and there's got to be a way to reach more people. So that's been in the back of my mind. And then a couple of years later, my daughters gave me, in February of 2007, an iPod for my birthday. And when I went to iTunes, I bypassed the stuff that you buy, the music, and they didn't even have TV shows or anything like that back then in iTunes, way back in 2007, right? But they had podcasts. And they were, like I said, they were maybe a year and a half old. And I thought, this is my bulletin board. This could do it. And I immediately went to work just devouring everything I could find on how to make a podcast. There was a great podcast at the time about how to podcast. And a month later, I had my first episode out. So I'm not one to sit on it. when something comes to mind and an opportunity arises, the only difference between me and anybody else is that I'll do it. So I went and did it, and I've just been having a blast ever since.
And how has hosting the Genealogy Gems podcast helped you in your personal family history research?
Well, it does in that it helps my listeners in that it's a global community, really. So it, in a sense, kind of takes social networking to a whole other level in terms of people all over the world can listen to the show. We have listeners in over, I think, 75 countries. And so I'll be typically using my ancestors as the guinea pigs for what I'm talking about, for what I'm researching about, the books that I write. And part of that is selfish because I'm hoping if I'm putting it out there, I mean, I obviously know these people, so they're great examples, but if I'm putting it out there, somebody listening, somebody reading the blog, somebody watching a video on my YouTube channel is going to go, oh, wait a second, I know them. In fact, Josiah, I was just at a presentation I did about 2 weeks ago, and somebody walked up and said, Jehu Burkhart? I said, yeah, because that's my Revolutionary War ancestor I'm always using as an example. She said, of Christina, and, she started naming off all the names of the people in his family, and I said, yeah, and she says, oh my gosh, we're like 12 cousins, 16 times removed, but we share that common ancestor. And that is just so cool. And I could tell you numerous stories about times when people have come up and in some way contributed to my genealogy, which I so appreciate. And every time I get an email from somebody else saying, oh my gosh, what you just talked about on the show just broke through a brick wall, I feel like it all comes around. And I love the idea that anything I say is going to help somebody further their research.
Now, you give some great presentations on finding living relatives when you're doing genealogy research. Why is finding living relatives so important, even when you're primarily researching deceased ancestors?
Well, if you think about it, the people who your ancestors were writing cards and postcards and letters and sending wedding pictures to, they were the distant cousins, right? They were the aunts, the uncles, the people down the other branches. So when we think about the first rule of thumb, which is go talk to your oldest living, relatives, people who are still alive, because, that's just immeasurable in value. The more I think about that, I think, well, but doesn't that mean then that the people down the other branches who are also getting older, they're valuable too, because they're people who are people we're talking to and obviously are related to. And you never know which branch of the family that photographs and heirlooms and mementos are going to travel down. And so to me, it just means endless possibilities in terms of connecting up and sharing what we know and sharing our heritage, our shared heritage.
What's your greatest genealogical success or breakthrough that came about as a result of you tracking down your living relatives?
Well, there's one that I know that I would put in the category of the greatest breakthrough. And then there's one that to me was one of the most satisfying because it really fulfilled a lifelong wish of my grandmother who has been passed for many years now. And the one that really broke through in terms of research that I was doing was actually on my husband's family. And in fact, I use his cousin as an example. Is really the main theme of my living relatives presentation, and I have a video on that as well. And that's because it was such an example of first cousins losing track of each other. And it sounds so simple, except women, when they get married, change their names, typically. And so it's not that hard to lose track of somebody, particularly when there's a woman involved. And in this case, it was in this case, his uncle had 7 daughters. So there were a lot of females who potentially all could have different names, last names at this point, and they all had very generic first names. And I say generic as in, Mary, Carol, Alice, Sue, that kind of a thing, which makes people very challenging to find. And so I go through in my presentation that process of showing how I kind of used some traditional and some non-traditional ways to eventually track her down. And indeed I did. I finally got a letter to her at the right address, and she picked up the phone and called me. And when we got together, it was just phenomenal. One, because when I opened the door, it was like looking at my husband's sister standing there. They're so similar. And she carried in this big, old 50-year-old cardboard box. It turned out that she had been the one to care for not only her elderly father until he passed away, but his father. And of course, that's my husband's grandfather. And that was the original impetus for the pursuit of finding her, was I was trying to find more information about my husband's grandfather. And she had all the pictures and the mementos and things from prior to him being of grandfatherly age, because she has all the things that he brought from England when he immigrated. And it was just amazing. And she's never had children, probably won't, and never married, and said, I think this needs to come to you. And so, bless her, she entrusted us with all those items, which, of course, we've been scanning and documenting and making sure that we get them back out to the whole family, because that's critical. It's wonderful to find people, but it's really important to give back.
Absolutely. What are some of your favorite strategies for finding living relatives?
Oh, I tend to like the unconventional things, because, we have our typical genealogical ways in which we do it. So obviously I'm going to go to Ancestry. I'm going to look on Facebook. That's probably the number one place you would go, right? And if you're active on Facebook, chances are Facebook is going to actually suggest to you who it thinks is your relative. So that's amazing. And I've had so many listeners email me and say, oh my gosh, Facebook just sent me this cousin and I've totally lost track of that side of the family, and now we're all getting back together. And so it's kind of amazing. And it does that based on using an algorithm behind the scenes of determining what data you've given Facebook and what data other people have and where are the overlaps, where are the links. And it can spot that in ways that we might not normally, or it would take us a long time. So certainly, Facebook and, I often recommend archives.com, which is owned by Ancestry. And the reason why that's such a good website, in particular for finding living relatives, is that they tend to focus on 20th century records. I think they came up around the time that the 1940 census was being released. That was kind of their niche, and they really focused on those records. And that's, I think, why they were also attractive as an addition to Ancestry. So that's a good website to take a look at. And then, of course, we have the unconventional ways, everything from there are websites out there where you can look up and see if people have made campaign contributions, whether they have certain licenses, everything from a beauty license to whether they are a pilot. In fact, did you know that in many states you can get information on a person if they have a hunting or fishing license?
Oh, wow.
Because in some states, that's a more challenging thing to get than even going to vote. You have to have a witness, or you have to have, get your name and address and phone number. So, and those, it's all public information. So, there's a lot of different nooks and crannies you can pursue. And I think it all comes back to based on what you know about the person. And just like with an ancestor, you sit down and you gather every little bit that you can possibly get from anybody who knew the person, anything they knew about them, because that's going to give you clues about where to focus your energy.
Now, you mentioned hunting and fishing licenses. Where would a family history researcher go to access those records?
Well, good question. Now, you can go to Google, and that's essentially how I kind of fell into this. In fact, I'm going to pull up my presentation because I can give you a specific URL address. But if you go to Google and you put in hunting and fishing licenses and for a particular state, So if it's the state of Oregon, you put in that. And typically that's going to bring up, perhaps at the city, county, or state level, they have the fishing and hunting license. And oftentimes those are going to be public and therefore available online. In fact, I'm looking here to see. I have my little presentation. We've got all kinds of other licenses here. So state game and fishing licenses is what you might call it. There is a book called The Source Book of State Public Records. It's published by BRB Publications. That is a terrific book if you're particularly part of a genealogy society. If you guys are looking to make an addition to your library, that's a book that could help everybody in your society find living people. There is something called Reserve America, and it's hunting and fishing license websites by state. So it's reserveamerica.com. And there's also takemefishing.org.
You mentioned a pretty positive experience that you had with tracking down a living relative. And as a family researcher, I think we know that not all of our experiences are necessarily positive. What are some of the considerations that genealogists should take into account if they're going to be publishing potentially negative or embarrassing or controversial facts about deceased people who still have living children or grandchildren, and maybe those children or grandchildren would not want you to publish those facts about that deceased individual? Have you ever come across that situation?
I certainly have, and I've certainly had listeners and viewers of my YouTube channel get in touch with me and say, just that, what do I do? This person's not going to be that happy. And I actually, for a long time, I don't have any stickies anymore stuck to my monitor, but I used to. And one of them always had said on it, living people come first. And I think that's so true. Living people do come first. That means when I was obsessing about doing genealogy, my kids, came into the room and they said, but we need your help with something. They came first. And I would sit down what I was doing and go do it, even though I was totally into what I was doing, when they were growing up. But I think that keeping in mind, one, that we better have our facts straight. If you're going to publish something, you have to have it really, really sourced. And even then, if you know it's going to cause people trouble and anguish, then I think that the self-question that we have to ask is, who does this really benefit? Is it important that this information go public? Or if you're talking about self-printing it, not having it for sale online, as far as like a book or something, and you want to give it to your close family and they're aware of these people, I think that's fair in that it's part of their life too. Certainly, I would think first and foremost, asking permission, checking with the person who's involved. In fact, it's interesting. I had a listener contact me about a week or two ago, and he was very concerned because he saw on Genealogy Roadshow where some basically bad information, if you will, was being said about his relative. And to the person who was part of the show, it was supposed to be all, wow, that's fascinating. Isn't that great? Well, at least now you know. And it wasn't her relative that was being, in a sense, criticized, so it wasn't a problem for her. But I thought, wow, that takes it to a whole nother level. It's one thing when we're personally publishing something or putting it on our website, but now you've got TV shows and they're reporting these stories, and of course they're looking for the juicy stuff, and yet that is somebody's relative. And that's what he felt. And in fact, it was in conflict with what he understood and what he had done research on. In the end, I encouraged him to go back and try to get in touch with the producers, and he did, and I gave him some contacts, and he said, in the end, they had the source, and they proved it. It was true. And he said it still wasn't easy to hear, but I'm really glad that they did their homework. So just be prepared. If you're going to put it out there, you better be able to make your case with solid source citations, because I think that you would owe that to the person that you might be potentially harming. And, it kind of depends how close to home it is for you. Are we talking about your father, your grandfather, or are we talking about, the great-great-uncle? So common sense is always a good thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think every family history researcher out there has stepped on at least one toe in the course of their research. What is the best way, in your opinion, to deal with a relative who might be uncooperative or hostile toward you when you try to ask them about family history? How can we stay on friendly terms with them or at least avoid unnecessary conflict?
It's interesting. I invited one of my distant cousins, Carolyn is her name, to be on my show early on because she is so good at that, making contact with people. And she has such a wonderful way that's non-threatening, and I think that's important is we have to know we are approaching their territory. If we pick up the phone and call them, and I always encourage people, don't be afraid to call. All somebody can say is no, and that's okay. But we have to be willing to accept it. And she has accepted it, but oftentimes she will leave an opening, and she will say, I really appreciate and respect that right now this isn't a priority for you, or this may be a problem for you, or, people do have their lives, right? Mm-hmm. She'll say, but if I do find something of interest, would it be okay with you if I went ahead and sent that along to you? I'd want you to have a copy of it. I'd be happy to share it. And she'll ask permission. Would it be okay if I just dropped you an email in a year just to see how you're doing and let you know what I found? And maybe if you're interested at that point, we could talk again. So while the person you're calling will often feel like it's a yes or no answer for my cousin Carolyn, and now for me and many of my listeners, it really isn't yes or no. Is this the right time? And showing respect and leaving openings, and then having a simple system that you can use to kind of jog yourself in a year or whatever time frame that you've given to follow back up. If nothing else, I've actually won over one individual in my family simply by absolutely accepting no problem, but every so often sending a small gift of a little book that I put together or some photographs they didn't have, just, funneling to them as I am with other people in the family what I've been finding. And sure enough, they came back and they said, okay, now you've intrigued me. Let's talk about this. So, it's understanding letting people be where they are, but keeping the path open to where you are.
That's such a great idea. And what are some of your favorite ways to package family history in a way that gets your relatives excited about what you're finding?
Well, I think anybody who's heard my podcast knows my number one is using Google Earth. And the reason I love using Google Earth for family history is that there are so many fantastic features in it where you can actually create a map that moves, that includes pictures and videos and documents and books and every kind of multimedia that you can think of can be added to a tour. It can be recorded as you're moving through the map. And then you can add your own voice. You can add music, whatever. But these are easy to create maps that can be easily emailed to somebody. They're small files. They can be played on anybody's computer who has the free Google Earth downloaded. And the amazing thing is that it turns boring documents and notebooks and file folders into what looks like a video game. Who doesn't love, a movie or a video game or a YouTube video, something that's moving and talking and there's action and graphics, things to see and to discover. And so I love that. I love creating. I've published two DVDs that are Google Earth for genealogy that walk people through, the step-by-step how to create them. And I've heard so many amazing stories of people sending these and going, wow, these family members of mine who just didn't get it and never wanted to look at anything in print would pop these on their computer and just have a blast, and be watching the video and having it kind of come alive. So to me, translating the information into something that's compelling and storytelling, that's short. Use the YouTube critique, or the YouTube criteria, which is no more than 10 minutes. Whatever you give them should take no more than 10 minutes to digest. So if you really want to go the print route, like a book or something, I recommend doing the Shutterfly books. They're like 20 pages, color, glossy, beautiful, but they're inexpensive to create. And they can be pretty much read with pictures and words telling a story of your family in 10 minutes. And it's something that can be like a coffee table book that can, stay on the coffee table, be shared with other people. And so whenever I create one of those, I usually focus on a story, not an entire family. You know what I mean? Not an entire lifetime, but the story of their Navy service or the story of their immigration. And the beautiful part of both of those, whether you do a book, a short coffee table kind of photo book, or whether you do a Google Earth video, map, is that they can start to collect together to create a bigger picture, right? So if each one is a chapter or a story, all of a sudden, a couple of years later, you find you've done 5 or 10 of them, and now you have a whole collection. And so you don't have to worry that I need to write the whole thing if I'm going to do it. Well, that's why we never do it. That's too hard. Putting it into bite-sized pieces is easier for us, and it's easier for our family.
That's such great advice. And I've seen books on family history that focused on just deceased people, and I've seen books that have included living relatives too. And in an age where privacy and identity theft are such big concerns, how do you help assure your living relatives that your interest in family history is sincere and that you're not out to steal their identity or jeopardize their security?
Well, I think you're right, because the number one question our bank used to ask us was, what is your mother's maiden name, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a problem because chances are it's going to be in whatever it is you're including. And that's why places like Ancestry, of course, make the living people private in the trees that we're all sharing. So I think we have to tread really carefully and be sure that we're using a method that can be, controlled in a sense, where it's distributed to. So I think that kind of too goes back to asking permission. And also, the truth is the basic names, birth dates, that kind of thing, that's all online anyway. So I think to a certain extent, we're all having to take our lumps with the fact that almost nobody is not searchable through Google. In fact, there's a website called Spokeo, SPOKEO.com, which I tend to call Spookio, because it's a little spooky how much it knows about you, even to having a screenshot of Street View outside your house next to your name.
Yeah.
That's pretty invasive. And so when you put information in like that, if you've already double checked and it's already online and you've asked permission of that person, I think then it's fair to put it on there because, to include it, whatever it is. But again, as we talked about before, before I put anything in print about somebody who was living or the direct relative of somebody who's living, I better have my facts straight. And I would highly recommend including your source citations, because I think that that's really critical. You have to also keep in mind, people also have the right to pursue you, even legally if they wanted to. So, you take calculated risks every time you kind of put that information out there. But when I did the small book, I did like a photo book of my husband's father's Navy career. I just double checked with his mom that she was fine with it, and I double, triple checked all my sources and had them listed so that I could say in good confidence, yeah, this is accurate. And but had I run into some terrible story, I would have absolutely done a whole lot more homework with my existing family, because my relationship with them today is far more important than me being, by goodness, I'm going to get that thing printed. Things can wait, they really can.
Absolutely. Have you ever had the fun job of organizing a family reunion? And if so, do you have any tips for people who would like to plan a family get-together?
I haven't done a family reunion, probably because I'm, 12 hours a day doing genealogy gems, but
Yeah.
in a sense, we're having one big online family reunion. It seems to be.
Yeah.
I hear from a lot of my relatives. But Sunny Morton, who is a contributing editor here at Genealogy Gems, she put on a huge, fantastic family reunion last summer, and she did a whole blog post on that with lots of great tips. So when people involved in our organization, are doing these things ourselves, then we try to make sure we get a blog post, or we talk about it on the podcast, or, we're doing a whole thing now in the book club, which are books that we're reading. And but she had some really great ideas on that. And one of the things that I've been kind of promoting and putting out there as an idea for people that I think is kind of really cool, would pleasantly surprise your family, is you can create a Google Earth map like I was talking about, what I call a family history tour. And I have converted those into like a game show so that every location is a question and an answer. And in fact, many conferences around the country, I have done Google Earth game shows. We typically do them as like a Friday night event before an all-day seminar on a Saturday. And it's just a blast. Now, when we do it at conferences, we're doing about an hour to an hour and a half, and I pull people out of the audience. So we have 3 people on each team, and they get up there and they have their little whiteboards and they write their answers. And so the entire audience gets to see what's going on up on the big screen with the Google Earth map. And as we're flying around the world, almost like an amazing race of genealogy, at each location, I stop and I ask them a question. And then I reveal the answer through another location and item on the map. And one of the neat things about that is that they learn about something about genealogy. They learn something about what Google Earth can do for family history and how it can be used in a presentation format, and they just have a blast. So I've actually recommended to people, you can take that same idea and turn it into a family history game show for your reunion, which I think would be really terrific because the kids are going to love it. They're going to see that and their eyes are going to get big because it, again, looks like a video game. And I think it's something that everybody can be involved in and kind of have a rousing good time. And you could even send them a copy of it just by email when you're done.
And how can listeners find out when and where you give these great presentations at conferences around the country?
Oh, sure. Well, my website is genealogygems.com. And when you get there, you'll find in the menu, it says seminars. And if you hover your mouse over that, there's a way to contact me for bookings, and then there's my schedule. And that's where I'm constantly adding each of the locations and dates, and I'll also have a link that will take you over to whatever the organization is that's putting it on, so you can check out all the details on their website.
And your Genealogy Gems podcast is also accessible at genealogygems.com?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, you can listen to it on the website. You can download it in iTunes, or we even have an app. In fact, we've had an app for, almost 5 years now, I think, and we have them on all the major platforms. So if you have an Android, Apple, whatever, we have an app for that, and it streams the show. And one of the fun reasons to use the app would be that you get bonus content. I always have a little bonus item there on each episode.
And do you have any exciting plans coming up in the near future for your Genealogy Gems podcast?
Well, the thing that we've been working on for about, 6 months, and we just launched, is our Genealogy Gems book club. And this is something that really came out of my listeners prompting me, because I've had a couple of authors on the show, and I've done some YouTube videos with them, and had the author of Annie's Ghost, Steve Luxembourg, and we've had Running Away to Home is just another wonderful book. And so the authors that come on the show have had a great time, and the listeners loved it, and they would start sending me their book ideas. And so Sunny and I were getting together because she's a voracious reader, and I said, Sunny, I want to make you the guru. You need to put something together where we can all kind of make this a regular routine. And that's exactly what we've done. So now every quarter we're going to launch a new book, and each podcast episode you get some behind the scenes, some discussion, and also interviews with the authors. So it's been really, I just love the way it's going, and we're just getting started, so it's going to be a blast.
That sounds great. Lisa, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Talk to you soon.
If you would like to advertise on the German-American Genealogist podcast, please click the Advertise with Us link in the podcast section on schmidtgen.com. Since we're such a young podcast, we have some really affordable prices if you would like an ad for your product or service to be featured in one of our episodes. Your advertisement will continue to pay dividends because these podcasts are archived, and everyone who goes back to listen to an older episode will continue to hear your advertisement. Contact us today to get started. I really enjoy doing this podcast, but I also enjoy researching genealogy for other people. My professional genealogy research services are available for hire on an hourly commission basis. If you have a genealogical brick wall and you'd like to get some expert assistance, please contact me at my website, www.schmidtgen.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of the German-American Genealogist podcast. I hope you'll join me next Monday when we'll be back with another fascinating topic and another brilliant guest. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.
Come on now, you've only had 3 pieces of rhubarb pie. Don't you like it? Have another slice now. You're gonna hurt my feelings if you don't.